Good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this genuinely special event on the importance of multilateralism and women's rights. It has become common to recognize that international cooperation is under stress and that the multilateral system is in crisis. Indeed, I think one of the great themes of this week, of this high-level week, both here at IPI and across the street, has been the need to move beyond the crisis. I just came from the UN launch of the Alliance for Multilateralism, an informal network of countries united in their support for a rules-based multilateral order, co-hosted by Germany, France, Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Singapore. Our IPI's president is moderating the discussion. It has also become common to recognize that one of the reasons for this crisis of multilateralism is the return of a populist nationalism that sets itself up in opposition to global institutions. But what has not become as common as it should be is the recognition that this crisis is being occasioned by a global pushback on women's rights. After decades of building a normative framework designed to ensure women's rights, a growing number of states are beginning to question these established standards in venues from the Commission on the Status of Women, of all places, to the UN Security Council. And this connection between opposition to global frameworks and a pushback against women's rights is not a coincidence. They are deeply related. Thus, when analyzing the current state of multilateralism, it is vitally important to include a gender lens. And we have a new issue brief out on that topic just yesterday. And this is not just about protecting already hard-won gains on women's rights. It is also about advancing the effectiveness and legitimacy of the entire multilateral system. Indeed, if commitments to gender equality and the women, peace, and security agenda are woven into actionable policy, they can be a driving force in the strengthening of the multilateral system. It should go without saying, I would think, that ensuring a robust and effective multilateral system requires the equal status and participation of what amounts to 52% of the population. Somehow it doesn't. Our discussion today will delve into these issues as we hear from two eminent world leaders who have made this topic central to their work. We have Her Excellency Ms. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand and former Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, and Her Excellency Ms. Irina Bokova, Bulgarian politician and former Director General of UNESCO. The two of them, together with former Argentinian Foreign Minister Susana Malcorra, have founded the Group of Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion, specifically to grapple with the relationship between women's rights and the multilateral system. And we are equally fortunate, I would say, that the event this afternoon will be moderated by Dr. Sarah Taylor, Senior Fellow at IPI and the head of our Women, Peace, and Security Program. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome you here for this conversation with two true leaders, two women who are truly global leaders. As Adam has just said, their biographies are extensive and impressive. You can read them. I won't try to read the entire thing out. I think we'll start right into the discussion today. As Adam noted, earlier this year, Helen Clark, Irina Bokova, and Susana Malcorra came together to lead a group of women leaders from around the globe to, quote, collectively call attention to the need to achieve full gender equality and empowerment of women across all ambits of society, and the critical importance of multilateralism as a vehicle in support of that. So today, we will be delving into what prompted this initiative, what the future may or may not hold for women's rights in a time of, shall we say, complicated geopolitics. We will have approximately 20 minutes of discussion. I will then open the floor to the audience for questions and answers, and we will be concluding our program at 2:30. So I have some questions for our esteemed guests. And the first question is to Helen Clark. So, on March 8th of this year, International Women's Day, you spearheaded this initiative to call attention to the deeply gendered nature of the current undermining of the multilateral system. What made this such an urgent issue for you? What have you seen in your work that prompted you to come together specifically on women's rights?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, it was on the 8th of March, International Women's Day, that we, as a group, issued the call and invited others who had been senior in the UN system, other women, to join us. And frankly, the demand has been overwhelming to say, yes, we want to stand up on this. So what prompted it was, of course, noting the attacks of populist nationalist leaders on the international system, but noting also that same persons tend to be attacking women's rights at home and then using the entry points they have through their governments in the international system to start to pick away at the fabric here, which is, of course, of great concern. So we as a group believe that the multilateral system has been incredibly important for establishing women's rights as a huge priority. And therefore, anything that undermines the multilateral system is bad for women, because we look to the multilateral system through its treaties, conventions, declarations, commissions, organisations to uphold and promote women's rights. And if you go back through the history of the UN, remember the UN Intellectual History Project actually identified the fight for gender equality as something that the UN has led on for decades. Clearly, the Charter established that rights for all were core to the organisation's mandate. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948, with the negotiations led by Eleanor Roosevelt, absolutely clear that there was to be no discrimination on a whole range of factors, one of which, of course, was sex / gender. We go through to the 60s with the Declaration in 1967 on the elimination of discrimination against women, the adoption of CEDAW in 1979, and the great thing about having a convention is that those who ratify it, and virtually everyone has, also report against it, and that gives civil society entry points for offering opinions. Then we had the major UN women's conferences running through, as I recall, from 1975 with Mexico City, Copenhagen, Nairobi. I was there as a young politician myself in 1985, and of course Beijing in 1995. Also the International Conference on Population and Development in 1994, which was, a high water mark on the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda. Let's not forget, because you've produced a whole paper around this, the Security Council Resolution 1325. The first time ever the Security Council had pronounced on women, peace and security. I'm still looking hard for the women in the front row of peace negotiators, by the way, but we can come back to that. You've got the ongoing work of the Commission on the Status of Women. You've got the mainstreaming of work on gender and promotion of gender equality and the work of all the organisations of the UN. And of course, quite recently, creation of UN Women, and then UNFPA with its dedicated sexual reproductive health and rights agenda. So there's a huge normative basis that has come out of the UN that is positive for women. And if the UN is weakened, and attacks on those who promote women's rights in the UN system accelerate, then we worry about what it means for women. And make no mistake, an attack on the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda is an attack on women. And I'll come back to more of that when you come to your second question. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. My head nodding vigorously at this. I'll pose the second question to you, Irina. In an interview when you launched the initiative, your colleague Susana Malcorra said you expected the effort would continue until UNGA. Here we are at UNGA. What are your thoughts on the need for this initiative to keep its momentum, and how you might link it with, just as Helen has been laying out, the various anniversaries, markings of important dates that are coming up next year, including Beijing plus 25, Women, Peace and Security plus 20, and with other global initiatives like the SDGs?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm so happy to be here with Helen and also with so many friends and I would say like-minded people. When we launched this initiative, and I'm speaking here, of course, under the control of Helen, we were quite a bit, first we were very bitter with what is happening in the world in terms of undermining multilateralism, and then, of course, the women's issues, which were a little bit, we started to be sidelined. And we didn't have the ambition to create something permanent. It was rather an alarm. We wanted to raise the alarm for something that is happening. And when the three of us exchanged among ourselves what to do, we reached out and we decided to reach to all colleagues, women that have occupied high-level positions in the UN system. And from something like 15, we grew to 43 nowadays, or maybe more than that, 49. So even I'm losing track of all these wonderful colleagues that are joining us. And we were quite modest, I would say, in this ambition. We thought that we have to launch an appeal, we have to reach out. It was before the Commission on the Status of Women, mostly because of that. And two issues, of course, as Helen just said, were on our mind. First is the multilateralism, which is under threat. And this is bad news, first and foremost, for women, because precisely the United Nations multilateralist platforms have given all that we have today. They have done what governments or in circumstances has not been done. And they have set very high, I would say, the bar, building on the different periods with the legal instruments, the legal norms, introducing laws, constitutions, changing, then moving higher, speaking about reproductive rights of women, then moving violence against women in all its different dimensions, then putting emphasis on women and education, women in workforce, women on boards, politicians, in all the political life, economic, and all the women in peace and security, of course, the resolution landmark 1325. And I think after really a period of building up, putting women on the heart of the Sustainable Development Agenda, not just with one goal, but mainstreaming in all the goals, with all the targets that are there. And after this period of building this huge momentum, what worried was now that all this is under enormous threat. And I think what Adam just said is not simply about keeping the gains. This is extremely important. But the problem is to move forward. It's not just to keep what we have, but we have to move forward. Because a lot of assessment nowadays, it is so that obvious. If you look at the Sustainable Development Agenda on any of the developments nowadays, yes, one would say that we have achieved a lot. Humanity has never seen in history an educated population. Health is much more advanced. In any of the areas, there are advancement. And the one area which is really slow, and everybody recognizes this, is women. Either women, girls in schools, either the violence against women. We even see setbacks. And I think this is what is the worst part of it. Instead of moving forward, we are seeing a lot of setbacks into this. Even if you look at speaking about the Beijing document, and like Helen, as a young diplomat, I was in 1980 already, the first conference in Copenhagen, which opened my mind and my eyes, but at that time it was more politics than women. It was, the time was like that. Then, of course, we went to 85. Once again, it was even difficult to pronounce the term sexism. There was huge debates, ideological debates, whether indeed discrimination against women is a human right or not a human right, whether it's a kind of a racism or not. And then we build the momentum, and the Beijing document nowadays stays even as a more progressive document than many of the documents that have been adopted afterwards. So I think nowadays we are really at a critical point of this. And either we do something, we raise our voices, we mobilize in order to move forward and to once again bring this agenda to the multilateral system as a priority, as an unfinished business and an accelerator to peace and sustainable development, or we just will not live up to the expectations of so many women in the world. And this is why we started this platform. I would say it's just a platform. It's a network, and if we can promote this agenda, what we are doing right now, we will be more than happy to do it because we believe in this and we are very worried.
Thank you. And I think that leads really well to the next question for you, Helen, which is reflecting on, just as you say, you launched this initiative in March, and right after that we did see very difficult negotiations at both CSW and on Women, Peace and Security. And so, given the depth of your experience in international politics, where do you see now the most significant challenges to move forward on women's rights? We're here at UNGA. What do world leaders need to do about these challenges when they leave these high-level discussions this week? And how do we ensure that as other discussions are going on about alliances for multilateralism, for example, how do we ensure women's rights are embedded in these global discussions and not sidelined?
So the most significant challenge clearly is around the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda. And let's be clear, if girls and women can't determine their future, if they marry, when they marry, if they have children, how they space them, the whole range of options, then they can never fully reach their potential because someone else, some other forces are controlling their lives. So it's absolutely fundamental. I was part of present at a launch yesterday of a campaign UN Women has launched in the run-up to Beijing Plus 25, and it's called Generation Equality. And what it's seeking to do is to link the younger activists for women's rights of today with those of us who've been around a while, and to fight across the generations for these rights, which are not yet fully established for every woman everywhere. Now, the Conservative pushback here at the UN and its negotiations and its meetings on this issue can become extremely acrimonious, as we saw with the Commission on the Status of Women, and there's nothing right about a presiding officer at such a commission meeting being reduced to tears by relentless attacks upon her. This is wrong. It's not the basis of diplomacy, but that's what things get to. You look at the outcome of the universal health coverage agreement that was launched at the summit. As Irina said, we're defending the language of 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. Haven't things moved on in 25 years? We can't move the language past that. So you're not getting references to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The rights is narrowed down to reproductive rights. Well, frankly, there's a much broader conversation that's being had, and that is a right of anybody to express their gender identity however they want to express it and have their dignity upheld as an individual. I mean, this is what's at stake here. So then you had here at the UN, at the Universal Health Coverage Summit, a joint statement read on behalf of 20 countries, very similar to the one that was read at the World Health Assembly in May, and it attacks the sexual health and reproductive rights language on the basis that it undermines the role of the family and promotes abortion. Well, let me be clear. Abortion is part of the menu of services. And I am old enough to remember a girl I went to school with dying from a backstreet abortion because there was no legal abortion. And there are many countries where that still happens today. I'm old enough to recall when young women who got pregnant as single women never saw their baby after they saw it at birth because it was taken away to be given to some nice, respectable family where there were two parents, right? That's the history many of our countries have been through and others are still fighting. So, any suggestion that sort of harks back to those days will get me extremely agitated. And the statement that was read on Monday also opposed comprehensive sexuality education. For heaven's sake, what core aspects of our lives and we're not to impart in our education system, basic knowledge. This is preposterous. I do chair the advisory board for the Global Education Monitoring Report, which comes from a unit in UNESCO, and they've published an excellent report on the need for comprehensive sexuality education. We have great champions out there for it, but part of the pushback is to say that this is a bad thing and shouldn't be covered in declarations. So if we're coming to where the next battlegrounds are, obviously the Nairobi meeting in mid-November, which is the Cairo plus 25, and we really need a visionary and ambitious document out of this, not, let's defend 1994, and then next year there'll be all the Beijing plus 25 events. Again, it'd be great to move forward from those 25 years ago. Great declarations it was, but things have moved on. I think if we're responding to the question, what do leaders do when they leave New York? Well, obviously reflect on the matters I've just raised, but also with respect to universal health coverage, which is a great cause, one of my hats at the moment is to chair the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health. And of course, we advocate strongly for that 70% of the population, which is covered by that definition, to be part of the design of the services that will meet their needs. And one of the things we're pushing now is to look towards an international adolescent summit for 2022, because adolescents are quite a neglected group. Everyone assumes, I think, if you've made it through age 5 and sort of through childhood, you're kind of on your way, and then health system doesn't think about you again for a while. Well, actually, adolescents have a lot of issues, and among those issues are the access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services. I recall when I was a young Minister of Health 30 years ago, I passed the legislation through the New Zealand Parliament which enabled under 18s to get family planning advice and the pill and whatever they wanted without having to ask their parents. That's still not a right in many countries. So, we want to put these issues, front and centre on the agenda for universal health coverage because, and very much bear in mind, what do youth want? What are they saying they need? What do women want? I think that's what we'd like leaders to go away thinking about. And just on that last point, a marvellous survey has been done of 1.2 million women by the White Ribbon Alliance on what do women want from health services. Number one, dignity and respect. So many women said, we go into health services and we're treated like dirt. And, we're persuaded that we should go to a health hospital to have our baby, and then it's dirty and there's not running water and proper sanitation, and we just wish we'd stayed at home. I mean, it's a pretty terrible state of affairs. So I think, if we take a gender perspective to universal health coverage and try and ensure that people have a say in designing the services that they need and have voice in them, we'll get much better services.
Thank you so much. I just really want that inclusive design via consultation to stick with us. And I think the another takeaway from your points is moving forward, we do have to be bold. We can't rely on language from several decades ago. We have to have a coalition that is built up to drive us forward for the next steps. And that leads me to my next question to Irina, which is, as we look forward, as we combat regressive impulses in the multilateral that are attacking the multilateral system, where are you seeing the most hopeful signs for women's rights? And similar to the question to Helen, what can world leaders see and emulate and replicate as good practice, particularly with the multilateral system under pressure? And I think maybe consultation and inclusive design is probably going to be one of those things.
Yeah. Well, to pick up also from what Helen just said, of course, in your question, I do believe that we have achieved a lot. There is a lot of outside us. There is a lot of positive results and practices and initiatives and ideas, platforms, you name it. We just have to look really at what are these and how it has worked through these years of multilateral engagement. Speaking about reproductive rights, I think it's very important, and I agree with Helen that it's sometimes at the heart of this ideological debate about women's rights. With my experience at UNESCO, because Helen mentioned the global monitoring reports, and because we have been responsible for the education side, for example, of fighting AIDS through education. And how can you prevent AIDS, the preventive role of education without sexuality education? And I know how difficult every time it was, even at those times, I'm speaking about 5-6 years ago, let alone now, to publish the sexuality education training manual that UNESCO with other partners is publishing every year. And this is critical for the health and the well-being of women, but also of families, of children. It is not just an issue of women's equality. It's an issue for community engagement. It's an issue for the health. So I believe if you go broader and present all this agenda, not just as a ethical kind of a framework for women, but as a societal problem, as a problem that is linked with the overall well-being of communities, of countries. I think this is very important. And I know we twisted the language around it. We should not call it the reproductive roles. We should call it something else. So be it. The problem was that we could do it. Also from that point of view, your question, I think building on what has been already achieved is important, albeit with the difficulties. What I mean, and Helen mentioned it, the critical, and I have been dealing a lot with this when I was at UNESCO, because it was our priority, and of course working on education, girls' education and others, the well-being of a girl. Indeed, the critical part of it is adolescence. And if you put adolescent girl into the heart of it, just take a 12 or 13 years old girl. Because before it was more kind of we were more focused on the early part of it, which is of course justified, but the critical is the adolescence. And this is where in many societies, not just in the poor environments and communities, in many societies, in even some developed countries, this is the time when the divergence of boys and girls starts for different reasons. But this is where girls either drop out of school, either they have been subjected to violence for different reasons. It's poverty, it's marginalization, it's stereotyping, lack of safe schools, you name it. But if the adolescent girl is there and she continues, she goes to a safe school, she's protected by her family, she's respected by the community, she's given the opportunity to develop further, I think the immense growth and opportunities for communities and societies should be recognized, and this really should be the priority. And it has been, as Helen said, quite neglected. We should not take it as granted that just things go on like we think they should go. There is some kind of a disruptive age for girls, and this is where millions of girls and then women are kind of a cut off the possibility to develop and to be equal with the other members of society. And just one last point, because I don't know whether you will ask this question, but I wanted to commend you and the IPI for your last report that you did on women, peace and security. I think this is the right moment also to mention this extremely important topic, because we are approaching also next year the 20th anniversary of the resolution, and we see also how important this is nowadays in the changing geopolitics, in this quite uncertain environment, in the conflicts that are unfortunately going on in many parts of the world. And this is also where the multilateralism has been undermined, and this is also where we see a lot of setbacks. And unless we kind of reverse the trend and we put once again the women's lens on the Security Council resolutions, you mentioned the difficulties that were in some of the decisions last of the Security Council. If you don't once again turn the lens and optics into this, I don't think the world will be safe. And I don't think that the decision we're taking in the peace is safe. That is why yesterday's coalition that Ada mentioned for the support of multilateralism, I really wish to see that women's agenda also on it, which I didn't see. But I hope the countries that are there, I know they support it, but they should really put it there, because this is the issue nowadays when we speak about multilateralism.
Very good.
I will say first, thank you for your support of our recent paper. I did not put her up to that, but I will take the compliments with my co-author, Gretchen. It's a really fundamental point that you've just raised, and that's one of the points that we try to make in the brief, which is there were published reports about a threat of a veto on the last Women, Peace, and Security Council resolution over sexual and reproductive health rights. I mean, it all lands in that discussion. It shows just how immediate that threat is. I am not going to take up all the Q&A time, I promise you. It's been an incredibly rich and robust conversation thus far already, of course, and so now it's my pleasure to open up to the floor for interventions. I will give everyone a bit of a warning. What am I doing here? We're at 10 to 2. We're at 10 to 2, which is I will ask you, please. We'll collect a couple of interventions from the floor. Please say your name. Please keep your interventions brief. I will give you fair warning right now that I will interrupt you if your comment goes on for too long, just so that we all know the playing field. But before we get to those interventions from the floor, it is my pleasure to call upon the Secretary General of the Club de Madrid, Ms. Maria Elena Agüero. I hope I have not butchered your name too terribly. We also do need to do microphones that are actually wired because of security scramblers across the street. Our wireless microphones are not working. Maria Elena.
Well, thank you very much to IPI and thank you to the panel, obviously. I basically want to refer to two things. One, I think we've all heard both Helen Clark, who is a member of the Club de Madrid, Prime Minister Helen Clark, and Irina Bokova, who is a longtime friend of the Club de Madrid, refer to the importance of multilateralism. I'd like to bring in an element, and that is the effectiveness of multilateralism that we've also heard mentioned, the effectiveness and multilateralism that delivers. And why do I do this? Because the Club of Madrid, which is an organization that brings together democratic former heads of state and government from all over the world, and I must say that while we have tried to, in the organization, to have as fair as possible representation and distribution of country experiences, having members from different countries, although they represent themselves and their experience and not their countries, but having members from different countries, different regions, also from a broad political, different ideologies, different political positions, but also to have as much as possible a gender balance. And this has not been easy, because there haven't been that many women who are democratic former heads of state or government. But those numbers are increasing, and I must say that among our recent members, we have more women, and let's make that happen. No? That's something that it's not only that we have to work on, something that we have to work on, but also society in general. But getting back to the multilateralism that delivers, and why do I want to stress that, is because we talk about democracy that delivers. And as we work on our issues and on democratic values and democratic leadership, it is inevitable for us to look at the importance of multilateralism and the links between what we want, what we're all working for, which is, yes, multilateralism that delivers and that democracy that delivers, how we can make these two the synergies between these two work is something that we are going to be focusing on more and more, because as we've heard and as we all feel, multilateralism is under threat, but so is democracy. It's not just a question of when we started, we focused on transition and consolidation of democracies. I think today we have to talk also about preserving and defending our democracies. And this is an element that I would want to highlight. And also, the two things that I mentioned earlier, the Alliance for Multilateralism that we have seen established, and other initiatives that are going to be appearing, and I'm sure they will be, several will be appearing this year, because we will see the UN celebrating its 75th anniversary next year, and that in itself is going to provoke a number of initiatives. Well, from the Club of Madrid, and I'd like to share this with all of you, from the Club of Madrid, we would like to engage with those that are working on this. And when I say we, it is always our members, who, as I said, are the former democratic presidents and prime ministers. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria Elena. Okay, it is time to collect some points from the floor. I will collect 3. I actually know that there was one in the front row. I believe that there's one in the second row. Do you both want to? I'll do Pierre David first, and then you do have to go up there, unfortunately. And then
it's very formal.
Yes, it does.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pierre David Jean from the Canadian Mission here, based in New York. I guess I had a question for the panelists. We all know, of course, that a multilateral system is made up of member states, and I was curious, based on your past experience as representatives of member states, how do you have any advice for us who are already convinced of the arguments that you've made? How do we engage those member states that are not convinced or that are pushing back? How do we begin to have these conversations with them to try to change this dynamic and try to move the system forward? If you have any advice based on your past experience that we can maybe apply, including here in New York.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Which one of you wants to? Sorry that I'm making everybody get up out of their chairs. You're all right? Yeah, okay. Just watch out for the cable. Yep.
Wow. Hi, everyone. I'm Cora Weiss, and I've been around for a while. 1325 is known by its 3 Ps: participation of women, protection of women, and prevention of violent conflict. Unfortunately, the word conflict has replaced a much smaller word that we used for centuries, war. And that's what they are. The violent conflicts are war. So it's wonderful to protect children and women during violent conflict. But wouldn't it be wonderful also if we didn't have to pluck rape out of war and let the war go on? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we fully implemented the Charter of the UN, which calls for save succeeding generations from the scourge of war? Do you integrate in your campaign the abolition of war?
There you go. Yes, I'll get my comment. And then we'll come back for some comments.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon. My name is Maverick Cabrera Bellezza from the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. And thank you to our esteemed panelists for the inspiring presentations. In this day and age of populism, which has resulted into misogynist leaders becoming heads of states, men who totally disregard global agendas and international human rights laws, especially laws and policies on women's rights and gender equality. We need pressure from the ground up to tell these so-called leaders that this is wrong. They cannot take us 100 or several hundred years back. We need to bring the concept and principles of multilateralism closer to the people. We need to bring the UN to local communities. And for many local communities, the UN is too far remote from their realities. We in civil society are already doing this through our localization programs, localization of 1325, localization of the Sustainable Development Goals, and local women in host communities and refugee communities leading humanitarian response. Now, we need the support of the UN and member states in our efforts to sustain these localization efforts. How do we do that? Thank you.
So, some really easy questions. Abolishing war, the localizing, the support for local communities, and the very UN and diplomacy-oriented question around advice for how to navigate these political waters.
Well, to begin with the question from Canada, which of course has a feminist foreign policy and feminist government, and we really salute that about Canada. What I would be doing now is having a good look at who the other 19 countries were who supported the statement that was read on Monday. Because I don't believe for a moment that all 19 of those countries really support that. But countries often have a lot of reasons for signing statements. Last year the statement that was drummed up was on basically supporting the war on drugs. And I'm pleased to say that my Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, refused to sign it, and if you didn't sign it, you didn't get to go to a meeting with the President of the United States, but that's the breaks, But there were countries that signed that statement that most certainly didn't believe it. So, unfortunately, this is the way New York operates, right? But I think for Canada and others, I think some quiet conversations now, because it would be nice if next time such a statement's read, it doesn't have 20 signatures. You could start bringing it down and start having a conversation about what the issues really are here. That's what I would be. That's what I would be thinking. As to Cora's point, I have found it a bit odd in recent years to be invited to participate in a conference that was aimed at eliminating rape as a weapon of war. And what kept going through my mind was, I'm against rape and I'm against war. So I'm not just against this very narrow little definition. So yes, an end to war as the Charter envisaged is the ideal, and an end to any form of violence against women anywhere in any circumstances was what we have to aim for. And for women, I think, let's agree that the peace mandate of the UN is so absolutely critical, because who are the major victims? Women trying to protect their families themselves in a context of war and upheaval. Let's hope some of these ideas can come into the UN at 75 discussion, which is active thinking about going on now. And with respect to the last question about how to, in a way, bring the UN closer to society, I have 2 points to make about that. One is, and because Cora quoted the Charter, I'll quote the Charter. It starts with the words, "we the peoples." But from 1945, it became "we the member states." Yeah. And you other people, you're out there. I think we need maybe to be thinking around the 75th discussions, can we make more inclusive multilateralism, where we accept that the peoples are very much part of it. In my post-politics and UN reincarnation, it's great to have reincarnations, I chair multi-stakeholder partnerships. One of them, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We have governments, we have civil society constituency, and we have the companies involved in the sector, all with equal voice, right? Sharing the partnership for maternal, newborn and child health. Secretariat and WHO, totally inclusive. 10 constituencies for that one. But, it's got me thinking about maybe how there could be some reshaping around here about voice. for society. You know, Gavi board is an example also of one that's more broadly based. The partnership sponsor board of PCB, Partnership Coordination Board, whatever, of UNAIDS is like that, the Global Fund. So, you know, out on the periphery, there's kind of, you know, multilateral partnerships which are inclusive, but not enough here. And let's think about how that could happen. The second thing is, I think that the UN country teams, which exist in developing countries, should all be encouraged to have very strong interface with civil society. Now, of course, not all governments like that. Some governments actually legislate against anyone giving civil society capacity building and other supports, particularly where it involves rights issues, including women's rights and so on, human rights. But really, there should be an onus on country teams to be interfacing with the societies, not just with the governments where they're present.
Thank you so much.
Probably just one word to add to what Helen said, just 2 points. First, starting from the last, I think UN should stand for values. Yes. I think this is very important. What you said about what UN can do, of course, we have decisions, we have documents, but UN should stand for these values and stand up sometimes, probably against some current, against some decision, but UN, that is why UN exists in the first place. And when we speak, of course, about gender issues, when we speak about women's, we have enough there to stand for, and just UN should do it. It should not shy away from the values that underpin, in the first place, this organization. I think this is very important. And from then on, of course, pick up everything that is being done now with the reform of the development system and otherwise. This is exactly when the UN should fill the gap sometimes, which is left by governments in some countries that they do not fulfill their obligations in abiding by these documents or by these respective decisions. I think this is very important. And the other point is about populism and misogynic. I think we didn't pay attention. When we say we, I think people who are thinking about it, that we kind of took it lightly that, okay, populism is there, giving simple answers to complex questions. Of course, it will twist a little bit politics here and there, but it will not affect so deeply some of the issues that concern us. And now we see that they're really turning against these achievements, these gains of us, and it transforms into, in many circumstances, into misogynic behavior and decisions. And this is already serious, and it's not innocent because it leaves traces, and it borders, I would say, to racial discrimination, to discrimination globally. And I think that is why it is very important to resist what is within this kind of a thinking. Always it's kind of a nostalgic about, family, women go back, take care of the children. The problems nowadays in the world are because women are not doing what they should be, doing. We hear this in many of these circumstances today, and I think we have to strongly resist this.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm going to take 3 more questions. I've got one here, and then one in the middle, and then I just ask you to keep them nice and brief so that we can do another round. So right here in the second row, and then, come to the podium, please.
Thank you very much. I am Nicole Hamlin, Vice Chair of the CEDAW Committee. Excellent. And I just want to say thanks. Thanks a lot for your outstanding engagement. And I share absolutely your analysis, of course. And we need you. We need you because probably the CEDAW Committee and CEDAW Convention are at the heart of the multilateralism. We have the convention, the most ratified in the world, 189 state parties. And of course, women's rights are the cursor of the civilization. And I must say that we have done a lot, and we cannot imagine today to abandon these wonderful successes. Because, and I thank all the state parties committed to support multilateralism. You are right, it is a political issue, it's a strategic issue, and women issues are not only important for women as fundamental rights, it's a lever of sustainable change, of lasting peace, and we cannot imagine today to have a sort of setback on that. I just want to say that this multilateral forum could be a very strong support for us. And I'm sure that because we are in the ongoing process of reform of treaty bodies, so it's very important to get the most large support. But I want to say that as French also, Beijing could be a change of paradigm. And I'm really very confident in our capacity with state parties, with civil society, with you, to not only to resist, but to promote a change of paradigm in leadership of women, to make them to pass from victims to leaders. Thank you.
Before we do that, I want to speak about victims for a minute. I'm Dr. Danieli, representing the International Organization of Victims Assistance, and I'm also a psychologist, so important to the comments. Most victims in the world are women. Most people affected by mental ill health are women. Cora, with all my love and admiration, UNODC just came out with the finding that domestic violence and intimate partner violence has more victims than all the wars today. It's all women, okay? The pushback, going back to Europe, fascism is back in Europe, and still Europe thought it's just a little thing, crazy, it won't have an effect. We don't learn from history. The one thing I do find hope in is that we do have this panel today, and you did create the group that I would love to be involved in. Because what we are saying is we won't let this urgency sleep again until it's much worse. And we women will hold the world in such a way that it can't just be thrown, and the achievements cannot be dismissed just because a few men have the vote. And to Canada, make sure that the right voices drown the wrong voices. That's what democracy is about. Teach the children.
Thank you. We have one more question, a comment over here, please.
Thank you very much, and I'm Blanca Montero from the UN for the panel and for IPI. I just have a very concrete question. There have been many initiatives surrounding women's leadership in international law, and my question from my own experience is whether you have a strategy to convince or gain the hearts and minds of men, because as you can see in this audience, as you can see in the Convention on the Status of Women, as you can see whenever there's a panel of all women, it tends to be that it's identified with women's issues, and women's issues are not usually identified with human beings' issues and development and peace and security. So I think that gaining the hearts and minds of men to actually participate in this agenda is a key aspect for the agenda to succeed beyond text and to achieve actual implementation. Thank you.
So again, some really easy questions to address. First, I think this issue around the CEDAW treaty bodies, multilateral support, the issue of quote-unquote women's issues and the way that gets sidelined, and then, of course, the general comment around prevention to the slide of fascism. So, yes.
Well, I can only agree with Nicole, my dear friend. We have been with her on so many fronts fighting for the gender equality and for women's rights. And you're indeed into this for a long time. I can only agree with you that CEDAW gives the basic legal framework, and not only legal framework, but I would say everything that governments have to do. But what I think important is that, linking it to the previous discussion, we have to hold governments accountable. Sometimes they sign international agreements, of course they present reports and otherwise, but this is where I think in different circumstances in countries, the civil society, different groups, we have to hold governments accountable. This is extremely important, and this is the role also of the UN. CEDAW is a wonderful platform, and I know that within you are doing precisely this, holding governments accountable to their commitments, to the legal instruments. But it should go beyond, I would say, one discussion or one meeting, and this is where the civil society plays a hugely important role. I would say the other question that was so passionately discussed, I agree with you, and it is so linked to the, I would say, to the third issue that has been brought about. It's very often that we convene together and we women convince each other that we are right, we have to do something, that our agenda is important. But this is where multilateral platforms exist in order not to go beyond our own kind of a space of women that are fighting for our rights, but to go into the global political agenda. And that is why we just discussed here with Helen, maybe our next initiative, because you're asking us what are we going to do next. Maybe next we will push this multilateral group of countries yesterday that they have launched this initiative to include women's issues on their agenda, because this is a core issue for politicians nowadays to take up seriously if they're serious about multilateralism.
And I would just like to say that, yes, I think that would be an excellent idea, not least because what we consistently find in so many of the areas in which we work is that we have champions in many countries, champions of women's rights, who somehow, when they go into non-gendered spaces, forget that they are champions of women's rights and that they have those obligations. Call it mainstreaming. So we do have time for a couple more questions. So I have one in the back, and I have one right down the back, and then I have one here. So there's a speaker in the back. There's a microphone in the back for the two of you. Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I feel honored to see two female Secretary General candidates in the same space here with IPI, and I'm always thankful to IPI. My name is Joanna Meyer. I lobby on water security, mostly a Trans-Africa water pipeline, but that's a separate thing. Last night, I had the pleasure of meeting with a friend who is a high-level advisor to a president of an African country. I just want to piggyback on a couple of the last statements. The woman in the blue suit with the long hair in the front. This is someone who has all the opportunities in the world, travels around to all the high-level meetings, yet still, in the midst of our lovely encounter last night, I was in despair because not only does he think Trump is okay, we were arguing about rape and that a wife is available for a man's whims, and that and that women are here to make children, and that if I don't want to have children, which is the case, what can we do? Yes, thank you. What can we do to encourage the education for men so that they see that their own economies will prosper if women are more involved and not just here for the whims of the men? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kyra. I'm from the UN Office for Partnerships. We talk about a lot about women's experiences, but as we know, women's experiences and their needs are extremely diverse. And I was wondering, is it enough to talk about women as part of one homogenous group, or is there a place in this discussion and debate and policy and programs for intersectionality and talking about cultural differences and factors such as race? And I know you mentioned age, but race is a big one. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Inga Ralph. I've been in this fight for many, many years. Was founder of Gender Action for Peace and Security. I was chair of Womankind Worldwide in the UK and advisor to the elders, and have huge gratitude because we stand on the shoulders of so many women who have fought and fought and fought this race. And my question is in response to something you said, Helen, which is about how do we do something new? Because can we see multilateralism in the bigger sphere? Can we take perhaps and ride on the coattails of the other things that are actually unifying, rather than this tendency to make a narrow issue, in which makes it so easy to get a huge target, a small target and a lot of reaction, rather than can we broaden that? Can we look at climate, for instance, which actually has been a very multilateral, has a lot of multilateral support. That arguably will have one of the biggest effects on women around the world. Can we look at economic empowerment, which again is becoming a much more cohesive force? So here we stand in this wonderful institution which has done so much towards bringing cohesion and peace and vision. Maybe we need to revision the multilateral piece and include also the democracy, which is coming bottom up rather than top down.
Once again, very small topics to grapple with. The patriarchy, as I understood the first question, women and intersectionality, that discussion, and then something new. So what I will do is I will pass to the two of you, if you're okay. These can be your final remarks and comments from today, and then we'll look to wind up.
Yeah, well, I mean, on something new, I think there is a strong case for the Security Council taking up the climate crisis as an issue affecting peace and security. Because as you get more water stress, land use exhaustion, desertification, you're going to get more pressures that in the worst case scenarios lead to conflicts, which then can spill over borders and so on. You also have the forced displacement issue from what's happening with climate, which has peace and security implications, not least where it spills over borders. I mean, most of the displacement will be internal, but there are identified hotspots where it won't be, and it will cause issues. So having that as a peace and security issue, climate change, peace and security, resolution, whatever, I think would definitely be something new. And always putting the gender perspective into it, because, again, women are the most affected by the catastrophic events associated with an increasingly unstable climate. If you look at the weather-related disasters, women are disproportionately the victims of those. The ones who just can't get away. They're often the most exposed at home with children, with relatives who are infirm or have disability. I mean, women just disproportionately suffer. Also, in my moving around in the years with UNDP and talking with women in very drought-stressed areas, often the men had to go for work. If your animals die, the men, they go south somewhere to try and find work, and the women are left, trying to cope with everything, selling whatever they have, and often there's nothing left to sell. So always keep that gender perspective. I think on the intersectionality issue, yes, of course, women are not one homogeneous group. We come in with many different backgrounds, to put it simplistically. But there are some basics, and I do think, sexual and reproductive health and rights are kind of basic. But I think it's important to support women who are fighting within their own contexts. And that really brings me back to the very first question, which related some rather unpleasant attitudes, shall we say. And the question was, how do you get men who think like that to see the bigger picture about the importance of the empowerment of women? And of course, not easy and partly generational. But sometimes when none of the rights arguments work, the economics ones do. And the truth is that women who are disempowered for the whole wide range of reasons, are limited in the contribution they can then make to the broader society and economy. UNDP 3 years ago released a human development report for Africa, which looked at the economic loss to the continent of gender inequality, and it came in at something like 95 billion a year. Now that got people sitting up and thinking, oh goodness, 95 billion a year is quite a lot of money. Maybe that's a reason for doing something about women's empowerment. To quote the old phrase of Hillary Clinton, gender equality is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And some people, we start with the rights argument, other people relate to the smart argument. So, let's whatever the reason is that they come on board, let's get them on board.
No final comments?
It's final.
Yeah,
Okay.
Is there a moment?
No, I was about to say I agree with Helen.
Well, I mean,
as always. But I just want to add something that Helen said, and linking it to the first question, making water security or some of these issues. I think women indeed, and women's issues stand into the intersection of so many of the pressing issues today. I remember early on when I was elected at UNESCO, I went to a chat and I just was taken with a boat over the Lake Chad, and I went to speak to the president of Chad, and I was pleading for girls' education because we know that in Sahel, some of these countries really are struggling with the issues of girls' education. And his reaction was immediate. He said, yes, I'm very much into this. Help me solve the problem with water, and then girls will go to school. As simple as that. And not only this, we can cite many examples where all these issues are relevant to women and to women's status in a society. So you can't decouple them. And if we speak just here about women's rights, actually we speak about development of a society. We speak about economic growth, because as Helen said, societies lose a lot, including in developed countries. In some of the, I would say, most developed countries, still they struggle with this problem, let alone with some of the least developed countries. And this is where I think the argument about reaching out to society, convincing member states that the issue of women's integration, involvement, rights, whatever we call it, is beneficial for families, for communities in different cultural circumstances, and for the society as a whole. I think there are plenty of arguments here to say that it is not just because unethical, it's unethical, we think it is right. And of course, it is not against men in any case, but that it is just a good, indeed, policy for the government. It's good for families, it's good for children, it's good for communities. It's about social inclusion, it's about growth, it's about justice. And I think from that point of view, using, of course, cultural approaches. I remember one very good project that we had. It was a partnership with Procter & Gamble for girls' education in Africa. And in Senegal, we went. And first, of course, we had to talk to the religious leaders and to the local leaders and to convince them that it is important. It was about dropouts of girls from school, young women dropouts. And this was the way also of using, I would say, the necessary framework culturally, societal, in the community to involve everybody around this idea. It requires, of course, work. It requires arguments. It requires sensitivity in many of these cases. But if we have to do it, because the outcome, the result, of course, is huge for the society and for the community. So I think we have plenty of arguments to reach out to different stakeholders, to partners, and to tell them that it is good. It is just the right policy to do.
Thus concludes our program today. I would try to sum up, but that would just be a fool's errand because it's been such a wide-ranging and rich conversation. I will make two final comments. As Adam noted at the beginning, as we've discussed here, a great deal of ink and effort has been spilled about the pressure on the multilateral system, but we are clearly not paying attention to gender and specifically to women's rights in the way that we absolutely need to. Gender is implicated in the political movements that reject multilateralism and strive towards isolation. These efforts are to control women's bodies, including through sexual and reproductive health rights. Violations of women's rights are part of the ways, as we have discussed, about the ways that conflicts are fought and are justified. And crucially, of course, gender equality, robust adherence to women's rights standards, including women's full participation in decision-making, are fundamental to strengthening the multilateral system, potentially ending war, and, of course, and to transforming the potential to transform the multilateral system so that it is more inclusive and more consultative. In short, we all have our marching orders. I look forward to working with you all as we put them into effect. And thank you so much to Helen and Irina for a wonderful conversation.